Good afternoon and welcome to the Committee for Workers International, the CWI, live broadcast. The Committee for Workers International is an international organisation of working people and youth throughout the world, fighting against capitalism, fighting for a socialist alternative. We've been rocked, of course, by the coronavirus crisis in the course of the past weeks and months, which has opened up a new devastating crisis. The CWI has undertaken many analysis and coverage of those events, which you can find on our webpage, which we encourage all of our viewers to look at, and that's at socialistworld.net. Now today we're discussing the latest document that we published, Corona Crisis Intensifies, Class Antagonisms Deepen. And to discuss that situation that's now unfolding, we have with us Peter Taaffe, the political secretary of the Socialist Party in England and Wales, and a member of the international secretariat of the CWI. So welcome, Peter. We're a long distance apart. We're applying the distancing rules and regulations, so there's no danger for health, etc. So welcome, Peter. So we'd like to start with really posing a couple of questions directly, which Peter would obviously like to respond to. So in the recent document that we've produced, it opens with a very powerful statement. Things will never be the same again, the other side of the corona pandemic. We have a global crisis and a human catastrophe, especially unfolding in the United States, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, Peter, in the document, you pose the issue of the prospect of an economic depression. So what will that mean for the character of global capitalism economically and socially as the crisis unfolds? And maybe as a subsidiary question, what will it mean in terms of the geopolitical relations that exist between the major powers, especially between the US, Europe and China?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And we deliberately started the document in the way that you've suggested in order to emphasize that this is not a kind of episodic event and then we return to business as usual. This represents a decisive and perhaps a much more long-lasting development than even the strategists of capital, the theoreticians of capitalism, if you like, have themselves kind of, when they're looking at the question of hoping against hope, it will not be. Things will never be the same again. Now, Polly Toynbee, who's the writer for the right-wing, social democratic writer for The Guardian, took up this point, not directly from our statement, but took up and said, well, people will say that things will never be the same again. But they recovered from 2007-8. Now, we never say never, but it's going to be much more difficult for them to recover from this crisis because of the scale of the collapse that has taken place. If you examine today's press, the following points are made by the representatives of capitalism themselves. They say, for instance, in the economy, signs point, and I quote here, to a catastrophic decline, a slump, a depression, maybe with depressionary tendencies. Monthly car sales have halved in Britain. Construction has taken the biggest hit it's taken for 10 years, and so on. And by the way, if we go across the Atlantic, you'll see it's about 50 million people who at the moment have been expelled from the factories. This is not just a little local difficulty. This is a world event that is taking place. And actually, they make the point and say, if this continues in this way, this will be the biggest collapse in the history economically, and certainly in the history of capitalism. Now, what do we mean by a depression? For instance, it's used very liberally, and it is quite accurate when you examine it. But for instance, in relation to the situation in the 1930s, we've had many economic crises. episodic crises, and they've overcome them. But they did never overcome the Depression. The Depression represented an absolute collapse in the productive forces. And despite the attempts in the 1930s, it took the Second World War and the destruction of the productive forces through war that led to the revival in the post-war period. The political preconditions was that capitalism was saved by the efforts of the Social Democrats and by the liberal bourgeoisie in the post-war period. But economically, they never solved the problems of the 1930s. There was endemic unemployment throughout. And that, unfortunately, is the situation that we face today. I wish it wasn't the case. Everything that goes with that situation itself. But even the ruling class are using unprecedented language. Today's Financial Times has a headline which says, we have to act in order to keep the pitchforks at bay. By pitchforks, they mean the working class ready to rise against this system. 50 million people expelled from the factories. Are they going to take this lying down? No. Well, the American workers are not prepared by their trade union leadership and by their so-called political leaders, but they will fight, and they will draw far-reaching conclusions. That's why when in other words, a drawn-out crisis with minor interruptions, but in a period, and I hate to say this, because we would like a certain economic revival that would give the working class strength, strengthen their position in the factories and allow them to fight back. Of course, there will be small increases in production, but this represents the open confession of the bankruptcy of capitalism. And in today's press, they are considering unprecedented considerations. For instance, there's an article again in the Financial Times that points to the idea of printing through quantitative easing, because that's the name that they've used, of printing bonds and other things in order to overcome the position. The Financial Times says the following: the pandemic will destroy the equivalent of 195 million jobs. Now, do you think the working class in America and worldwide are going to calmly sit back and roll Easter eggs in preparation for this? They're going to be stunned, and then there's going to be a bitter anger amongst working people as far as that's concerned. Trump has no answer to these problems. The Surgeon General of the US said in the last couple of days the US faces a Pearl Harbor moment. It's a combination, actually, of 2011 and a Pearl Harbor moment, which is the biggest defeat, really, of American imperialism. And what does that represent? I mean, this is another phrase from the press this morning. Across the Atlantic, we could reach 52.8 million. There's never been such a collapse as that. 46 million will be laid off, is already in the process of being laid off. Macron in France says boldly, we are at war as the adults of the bourgeois themselves. There's only been one depression, I was saying, as I said, that came from the collapse in 1929 and lasted throughout the 1930s, and was only solved by a bloody world war where millions of working men paid the ultimate price in the course of that war. That is not open to the ruling class today. It will take the form of a social war against the living standards of the working class itself. So the reason we made that point is we have to prepare. The labour movement has to prepare. The American workers, who have not been the most advanced guard of the working class, they have actually used the phrase in Amazon, I quote it, in an article that I've stated, where they say to Bezos, you don't create the wealth, we create the wealth. the hundreds of thousands of Amazon workers. Bezos is the richest man in the world. By the way, him and Donald Trump have taken a hit on their income. Donald Trump's so-called income has gone down from 3 billion to 2 billion, and he could be down to his last billion on the basis of the trends that are likely to develop. Working class is not going to set this.
No.
This means a world in turmoil. It means a world that will challenge capitalism. And that's where the labour movement and the working class worldwide, that's the great advantage of globalisation. It's unified, the only advantage in a way. It has unified the working people from a world point of view. That poses the question of what kind of society we're likely to have. Alongside of all of this, they're trying to put on the shoulders of the working class the responsibility for this crisis. That will be resistant. There's a certain national mood developing. Let's get behind the governments that are in power. It's ephemeral. It won't last. All the class contradictions that have been sharpened by this crisis will come to the fore. That's where we come in providing the labour movement with a programme to show a way out.
So it's very clear, Peter, that it's a devastating position which is probably unprecedented in the history of capitalism. Now, in this crisis, we've seen the capitalist classes globally have abandoned really neoliberal policies. They've just jettisoned them very quickly and turned to state intervention. Now, why have they done this, and how far do you think that state intervention can go under capitalism?
Well, it's a very good point again, Tony, because that's the essence of the matter here. They have no solutions other than relying on the capitalist state, their state, to intervene as they did in 2007-8, when, let's remember, the British government took over the Royal Bank of Scotland, and it's still technically in the hands of the state. They haven't been able to sell that up. No, there's no takers for RBS. A lot of the other more lucrative sections were restored to so-called private enterprise, which is the private criminals who've tried to reap reward from the privatization of these former state assets. But you know, old Friedrich Engels in the 19th century made a very important point when he said when the German state took over certain sections of collapsing industry, and he said that this was the invading socialistic development or revolution, if you like, the same idea. And what he meant by that, it's a confession of bankruptcy. Because after all, Boris Johnson, when he was well, and his government, their philosophy was let the market rip. The market is superior. Thatcherism was triumphant. This has been the prevailing philosophy of the ruling class, and therefore keep the state out of it, privatize. Now they've been compelled to take over the railways. They will be compelled to take over other industries, particularly when the employers try to close them, like closing a box of matches. That could come in the next period. And what does that say? Except that capitalism is no longer capable of managing and organizing the productive forces, the development of industry and so on. So in this situation, you could have colossal pressure, particularly where workers are made unemployed, for their factories, for their industry to be taken over. And that raises the question of what kind of alternative. We believe in a democratic socialist plan. For instance, you might not believe it, but we even are prepared to give even Donald Trump compensation on the basis of proven need, maybe at the same level as social security payments in Britain and elsewhere. But it'll be a small price to pay for us having the productive forces which then can be managed by a democratic organized plan of production drawn up by the working people. We used to say that this was the music of the future. No, it's the music that will be played out on the streets of London, in the provinces of Britain, in New York, which is an absolute catastrophe, throughout the US. It represents an explosive condemnation of world capitalism.
Well, one of the aspects that we have, of course, is an unprecedented position with probably over half the world's population, if not more, are currently living in a global lockdown. Now, many governments around the world have assumed quite authoritarian measures to try and implement that lockdown. How does the CWI view that question?
We're absolutely opposed to all attempts to infringe the democratic rights of working people. We are for the flourishing of democracy, of the right to strike, of freedom of assembly, of the right to vote. But the reasons why now the ruling class are assembling water cannon, are assembling means of repression, it's already underway at the present time. I mean, by the way, they have to do that because the stock market, as again indicated by the press this morning, there's a handful of billionaires really that control the overwhelming majority of the means of production. And working people are not going to accept. They might rub along with the situation when they're getting an increase in wages. But when they're faced with the situation where they can't manage from hand to living from hand to mouth, when you have the position in the advanced industrial countries that's bad. But look at the situation in South Africa, where the only answer of the black ruling class there, well, black and white ruling class, is repression, is water cannon. Look at the position in Ecuador. I mean, you've been to Latin America. There are vultures who are flying over the capital of Ecuador at the present time. We used to repeat Rosa Luxemburg's idea. It's either socialism or barbarism. And we identified barbarism with capitalism. But there's real barbarism, which is on the streets of Latin America today, in Ecuador, in Chile, in Brazil, with this creature, Bolsonaro, who's compounded the problems of the people. All of that will come to the fore in the course of the next period. So we have to oppose any attempt towards repression, even, by the way, with the lockdown. Of course, it has to be done. Most people support it because of the danger to health and so on, and the multiplicity of the character of this crisis. But nevertheless, there has to be democratic checks, and there has to be. The British ruling class boast that they rule by consent. Well, they've shown really a little bit of repression in the course of the last period, and that is unacceptable. Once you engage, you give your little finger, they are prepared to take your fist, take your arm, and so on. Before we know it, we could be in the position of Hungary, where it's a rule by decree, and many other countries throughout the world. So we resist this idea that repression will act in order to produce order and save working people from the indignities that they face at the present time. We need the maximum openness. We need the maximum democracy so the issues can be discussed out, and let's fight them out politically before the court of public opinion, and arm working people with, first of all, an understanding and then a program to solve the problems of society and of the working class.
Now, it's evident from what you say, Peter, and if we look at the situation, that the class antagonisms, the gulf between rich and poor, all of the divisions along class lines that exist within society have been dramatically exposed in the course of this crisis, and that applies in every country, on every continent. Now, in particular in the neo-colonial world, we have an absolutely devastating position. How do you think these class divisions have been reflected in the course of the crisis thus far? And what do you think has been the role of the trade union leaders to try and deal with the question of the protests that workers have initiated and taken in a whole series of countries?
Actually, you've hit the nail on the head again, Tony, full marks. Because there's no doubt about it that after an initial period of all pals together, never mind the weather kind of philosophy, now we're moving into the phase where it's much more threatening not yet openly repressive, even in Britain, by the way, with the illness of Boris Johnson, and the people have stepped in, other Tories have stepped in to his shoes. There's no democratic discussion on that. How are the decisions taken at cabinet level? There's an issue there. And what are they likely to do in relation to democratic rights? Once working people, trade union rights, once working people fight for an increase in wages, fight against the closure of the factories, fight against the absolutely scandalous position where workers are endangered because they have inadequate safety equipment, and then when they decide to take action, they're condemned by their so-called masters, by the ruling class, by the bosses and so on. Working people should be vigilant in defense of their democratic rights that have been fought for against an undemocratic dictatorial boss class. Look at what happened in Amazon in the US, a marvelous movement in New York. I did an article in relation to it. And look at the language that the workers used there. They said in relation to Bezos, you don't create the wealth. We create the wealth. And that's a maxim of Marxism. All value is created by the labor of the working class. And the profits are the unpaid labor, which is taken back out of the pockets of the working class by the ruling class itself, by the capitalists themselves. And these workers said openly, we are the one who creates the wealth. And yet you have amassed a colossal fortune. You're the new kings. You're the new superpower. Well, we're telling you, you're not getting away with it. And when one worker said in the course of his comments to the press, his stand against Bezos and against the bosses represented a revolution, and there is a tradition in the US of revolution going back to the American Revolution, going back to the Civil War, going back to the independent movement of the working class. We say that the American workers can become the anvil upon which a new future, a new human future can be shaped of democratic socialism worldwide. And that's a struggle to defend what we've got. What are we asking for? We're not asking for the moon. We're asking to defend our job on the basis of the income that we have and an improvement. We're asking for housing. We're asking for education. The other side of this crisis, all of those demands will come to the fore. And we will be behind those workers who are pressing in that direction. To any unity with bosses or their government. No to a national government. What is a national government? A national in the current situation means the interests of the ruling class. It's impossible to overcome the class divisions in society. Anybody who talks about the nation in the sense that we can all link ourselves together in a national government, a national enterprise and so on, I automatically put my hand on my wallet when people come forward with that kind of thing. They're frauds. They're not expressing the reality, which is the reality of class society. We base ourselves on the struggles of working people who represent all that's positive, all that's cultural, all that can take this society forward and create a new world, which will be a democratic socialist world.
I think one of the issues, because it's obviously a global crisis, but perhaps because we have a number of viewers from Asia, Africa and Latin America looking in today, but we have the prospect not only of a crisis in many of these countries, particularly in the neo-colonial world, but of almost a collapse into barbarism. Maybe you could outline a little bit more about the horrors and some of the developments taking place under the Modi regime in India, Bolsonaro you've mentioned already in Brazil, but in some other countries as well, because although the corona crisis has lagged behind a little bit in hitting in these countries, an avalanche appears to be in the process of taking place in these continents. So maybe you could say a little bit more about those developments.
Yeah, I got the last part, Tony. The other part was a little bit fuzzy, but I get the drift of what you're trying to say. What we are talking about here is the majority of humankind in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And the figures are absolutely stark. We will suffer, and our suffering in the situation. That's the reality. The barbaric life that millions of poor workers lead, that's the reality that they confront in this society. But look at the position in the so-called neo-colonial world. Look at the position in Africa. 10 million workers, it's estimated by today's press, will die as a result of the pandemic if there's no measures put in place. The faint hearts, the bleeding hearts are talking about a moratorium on the debt. We say that's not enough. Cancel the debt to Africa, cancel the debt to Asia and to the other countries where the poor people live. Look at the catastrophe of India. You and I have been to India. We have a section of the CWI in India, those heroic comrades who are fighting against rotted landlordism and capitalism. And Modi represents crude reaction, and he's going to face colossal opposition from the Indian masses and the working people generally. His only solution, like Bolsonaro, is to unload the responsibility on the shoulders of the poor peasants and the working class. And they are not going to take it. They're going to fight against Bolsonaro, against Modi, and against all the despots and the dictators in the world. According to today's press, there's only a few places in the world who haven't had coronavirus. Samoa, I think, in the Pacific, and one or two other places. So the whole of the world is caught up in this multi-sided crisis of health, of the economy, of our standards of living, and so on. And the younger generation are just not going to accept it. I'm with them. They can fight, and we are with them. And we intend to recruit them and win them to our ranks in the next period in order to help in the assistance of the creation of a movement that can in turn arm the labour movement and arm the multi-millioned masses in India and elsewhere. In Africa, it's split into different countries. We need the Socialist United States of Africa. We need Socialist Confederation of Asia, of the Indian subcontinent, not the backwardness and primitiveness of Modi and the landlords and capitalists. Away with them, sweep them into the rubbish bin of history. You know, one of the papers described today the situation with the example of the Russian Revolution. It's not the 10 days that shook the world. They described it as the 100 days that have shook the world. I think that's a very good slogan. Okay, we started. Let us finish it by creating and rebuilding a powerful labour movement that links up with working people. And in that way, we will create the force, the lever for us and working people to change the position and create a socialist world and banish the horrors of capitalism and the horrors of the virus and the rest of it. And by the way, let me just make this point. Perhaps it's the last point, I don't know. But if we were in power in this society, the ruling class, the ex-ruling class, will be blaming us for not preparing. The ruling class, the capitalists, the landlords throughout the world, they knew that a pandemic was developing. They were asleep on the bridge. They are responsible for the millions of people who've died, who've been killed, who've been thrown out of work as a result of this situation. We don't accept it. I've never accepted it. We're going to be joined by millions of other working people who are going to rally to our banner. So don't hesitate if you're watching this today. Don't hesitate. Join with us. Join hands with us across the oceans, together, across the countries. Join with us in creating a movement that this time can create a new socialist world. You know, even Gordon Brown has now started to quote Lenin, quoting us actually, when we said that, you know, there can be periods in history when one day is like or 20 years can be like one day because there's nothing happening. There can then be one day in which the events of 20 years can be compressed. That's the period that we're in now. Don't hesitate. Join with the future. Join the socialists. Let us together create a world in which all the demands of working people, the young people in particular, can be solved, and we can create a marvellous new world which can satisfy and bring out all of the cultural and individual demands of the working people, and above all of the new generation.
Well, I think, Peter, that really brings us to a very good conclusion and summary to the position that we've had during this interview. So I'd like to thank all those viewers who've tuned in today. If you're interested in finding out more about the CWI, the Committee for Workers International, would like to join our ranks or discuss more with us about the ideas we defend, the analysis that we're making of this crisis, then contact us at our webpage, socialistworld.net, and tune in again. We're hoping to do weekly broadcasts every Tuesday from 3 p.m. London time. So thank you again for watching, and stay safe, and let's continue the struggle of building a fight against this coronavirus and the capitalist system which has produced it. Thank you very much.